So I finally finished the Grand Tour, knowing that the Elden Ring DLC was coming out in June. I played Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring all in a row starting in like April. All DLCs. I did New Game Plus for Bloodborne and Sekiro. What's funny is at the end of all these, as the final capstone, you have the largest and most expansive game of all of them. With the DLC and some pretty generous chunks put into Radon at the end of the DLC. The game took me like 230 hours to play. So when you play all these games in a row, you sort of want the final game to be a game that kind of tests your mettle at the end of it. So there's a lot of ways that this game, you can try to figure out how to make the game as hard or as easy as you want it to some degree. That's been a big part of the discourse and a big part of what people talk about a lot in this game is that, sun's kind of my eyes here, is that like, how like there's been so much discourse about what the difficulty is like in these games. But one thing they do very, very well, and this is kind of getting to the heart of what I think is so extremely good about this game, which probably is a strong contender for the biggest game of sort of the pandemic era, is that instead of some sort of lever like changing the game difficulty between easy, normal, and hard, they allow you to sort of approach a boss fight the way that you want to. Something I've learned over the course of streaming these games is that this is a generalization, but there's essentially two camps of people. There's people who are like, I'm not really concerned about what I'm wearing, but like what my build is, something like that. I think that I can like mechanically out-execute this fight, learn the boss, and outplay him. And that's where they derive their satisfaction. I'm very much in this camp. The second camp is like, I want to be able to use my head to set myself up to have a lot of advantages in this fight. And this game gives you a lot of different ways to do this too. You can always switch your build up if you're so inclined and all these things. So there's essentially sort of two camps in how people find their satisfaction in this fight. And also the reality is how much time you want to put into it. Some people have more time for these things than others do. So that's one thing this game does very, very well, is that this game does, if you want it to, have some of the most challenging boss fights, especially in the DLC, that you've had in any of these games. But if you want it to be more like almost like an MMO style encounter where you're managing threat, and trying to take down him with your foes, with your like friends who you've made over the course of your questing, you can do that, and it's still obviously a sense of satisfaction for a lot of people. Having tried to play this without summons, with a few exceptions, Renala had like 70% magic resist, and I played this game as a sorcerer. A couple of other circumstances where I did use summons, probably less than 3 or 4. Generally speaking, if you want to play this as hard as you can, having then played all these games beforehand, I found myself sort of getting to a point where like my fuse was pretty short. I was getting pretty like, I don't know, so all these games are learned by failure, challenging boss fights. The game is sort of like stymieing you by frustration. So I found myself sort of getting into the DLC. I was fighting Rolana around that point, about a third or a quarter of the way through the DLC, and I realized like to some degree I was getting pretty like weary with all this, and I was looking through my VODs to find thumbnails, and I was watching 2 different encounters in particular. I was fighting Rolana, and I was slowing the game down to 0.25x speed, and I watched her do her penultimate ability, the Twin Moons, where she floats in the air, drops 2 successive moons on the ground for enormous explosions the size of the arena, and then drops for a third one herself. And then I was also watching a fight with one of like the several ghost flame dragons that you meet in the expansion. I was on a place called the Cerulean Coast, which is this extraordinarily beautiful area where the coastline descends down to the ocean, and there's tens of thousands of flowers littering everywhere. And there I was on my horse, watching this at 0.25 speed. I was on my horse, the dragon is pursuing me, I'm running backwards toward the camera. He summons these undead pikemen who are like reacting to me, stabbing me, growling at me. Sometimes I even saw ones that I never even seen in the full thick of things that were blocked by his wing or something, where I narrowly avoided death without even really noticing it. And the thing really struck me that I really needed to appreciate, which is, this is a staggeringly beautiful game. The magnitude of these spell effects, the sheer quality of animation of what these guys look like, what the backgrounds look like with the Erdtree, the sheer beauty and scope of the game is like literally, I think, second to none. I don't think this game even has I don't think there's even, to my immediate recall, a strong silver medalist for how outstanding this company is at creature and monster design. Think of all the boss fights, particularly the sort of story-based boss fights or more major bosses that have some sort of cutscene at the beginning and or in the middle as they change phases with the most grisly, grotesque transformation sequence you've ever seen, and how extremely beautiful it is, and how incredible they are at having bosses as widely varied as Godfrey, and especially in his second form, which I found to be one of the most exciting fights in the world in the entire game, because it wasn't, oh damn, he hit me 30 times and now I'm dead. It's like, if he catches you, you're dead. It's like Zangief. That's extremely cool. Compare that to Melania, how different those people are. The transformation sequence of someone like Mesmer in the DLC. All of these moments are extraordinary, and they do such a good job of it. And there's not someone else who's really, it's hard for me to think of a company that does this to the same way. So a friend of mine one time talked to me about what a tour de force is. We're talking about Jay-Z's The Black Album. And the Black Album maybe isn't like the most in-depth or creative album that Jay-Z had, but a tour de force is the, let me show you what I can do album. He said it was very similar to Abbey Road by the Beatles. He knows a lot about music. I trust him on these things. Elden Ring strikes me as their tour de force. You can sort of tell from interviews that they're probably not going to make the next game as big as this one, as expansive as this one. I think it would be a mistake to make an Elden Ring 2. That's sort of a disease of more strategy. This is sort of like their big technical achievement, to some degree kind of like what Baldur's Gate 3 has been for Larian. Though Larian might go bigger more likely than this company does. Anyway, I digress. But just in terms of sheer scale and iterating on a high fantasy framework, this is one of the most broadly accessible, exciting, deep, and interactive and entertaining games that you can find, really. Something that I really think about a lot is how, when people think of an RPG, they think of something like Baldur's Gate 3, they think of something like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest or something. What's that? Turn-based battles, huge amounts of questing, interminable dialogue, all these things. But Elden Ring has quest lines, however meager they sometimes can be, and how, like, I don't know, murky and obtuse they sometimes can be. You're still putting points into dexterity, strength, intelligence, mind. The world itself, the character you make, it's a way of doing an RPG with all of the tropes and all the things that are appealing to people, of where you can make things in a video game that you can't so easily do in so many other mediums. But they also make it, like, appealingly difficult. A lot of people, either watching someone play a game or playing it themselves, they're going to get pretty bored with playing games I love, like turn-based tactics games, you know what I mean? This game gives you like an intense amount of challenge, a huge variety of ways of equipping your character, and they still make something with replay value in a very different way. That's something that I think is actually one of the biggest strengths of this. I want to hold my right hand. One of the biggest strengths of this game, and I've noticed this ever since about Dark Souls 3, is that for some people, once they find these games, these are the games you're going to play. I know a lot of people with like 600, I routinely hear people with 400 to 600 hours in Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. This comes from several factors. One, it's pretty satisfying to make a new character, arguably more satisfying to make a new character than to do a New Game Plus. There's a ton of story there if you want it. You can basically do the game as a boss gauntlet if you're so inclined. And then if you want to watch videos, if you want to read the item descriptions, there's a ton of lore there. There's tons of people who are really into the lore of this because they feel like they're discovering something. People who aren't necessarily big, I don't know, fantasy world people, or like, I don't know, read a lot of fantasy books or read a lot of books generally speaking. There's something about like the high impact gameplay of this with the fact that you can learn a bunch of stuff, which I think is deeply appealing to a lot of people. Having different builds. A lot of these things there's a lot of ways that people, once they start to play these games, are like, why would I play many other games? I can just play another build I can just play another build in Elden Ring, something like that. That's a huge victory for the company, I think, to get that sort of replayability and that sort of brand loyalty. That's excellent. That's excellent for them. Oh, no, my right hand, there we go. Compared to a game like, say, Sekiro, do I really... like, putting points into intelligence, putting points into dexterity, stamina, things like that, that's not a whole lot of satisfaction. You're hitting your break points. You're getting to whatever the points you looked up a guide on what your hard or soft caps are. I can't say that's like the most satisfying way to ever play a video game. Do you know what I mean? I really enjoyed in Sekiro how you'd accumulate points and then cash it in for actual skills, whether passive or active combat arts. That was something that was satisfying and truly changed your playstyle over the case of the game. The only way that ever really happens at this point is when you need certain amounts of strength or intelligence to use a weapon. With all these Souls games, I tried to use a different build in every game. For this one, I figured, since they've been doing this for a while, there's probably like the arsenal is much expanded. So if it's finally time for me to play sort of like a sorcerer or wizard type character, this was the time to do it for sure. And so I did do that. I do think at some level, my friend of mine said this, that I think FromSoft still doesn't quite nail the caster fantasy in these games. I kind of agree with that. The vast majority of your arsenal are homing projectiles that go toward the target from range. You're a ranged damage user, but are you a mage with a vast array of different things to do? I don't think that's necessarily always the case. Like, think of like a frost mage in like World of Warcraft or something. I'd love to have a frost nova. I'd love to have a blink. Some more trickery, but with the way that this game has relatively slow cast times, you're still just a guy rolling around and finding opportunities to hit people. You're just doing it at range, and people think that you're like overpowered because you do a lot of damage from range. But even compared to like the faith-based incantations, I felt like I had probably 60% or 70% of the amount of spells in my arsenal as they offered. Though, like, there's a ton of faith spells in this game. I was really surprised by that. I think overall with equipment, to some degree talismans, but also sort of like an arsenal of spells, I still feel like they're a little bit shortchanged, although you do have, how much can you really complain if you have 60 or 70 spells over the course of a game, even if some of them are strict upgrades on other ones. A lot of people will sort of like scorn the caster playstyle, but like, oh, you're playing intelligence, lol. I think that for a good chunk of the game, you don't feel like you have much particular advantage or you're particularly strong. Once you hit about 55, 60 intelligence, for me, that was around the point that I hit Altus Plateau and Lindell. That, and then around that point, got Combat Azure. That gets to be a point where you then, to some degree, sort of steamroll the rest of the main campaign. Obviously, there's big difficulty spikes with Melania, and Radagon for me was quite difficult. I understand most melee characters find Radagon easier than the Elden Beast more difficult, but Radagon, sort of in a similar vein to Promised Consort Razan in the DLC, or like say Nameless King in Dark Souls 3, with like the delayed explosion AoEs on the ground after he attacks, and the fact that you can't really stagger him because you're doing magic damage, that was a fairly difficult fight for me. But most of like the latter third of the game, you sort of roll through. Obviously, as I think I mentioned before, Renala was one of like the larger challenges for me as well. I think she has 70% magic resist. At that point, if you haven't been playing the game in a conscious way where you're cultivating the right spells to use, I think I had one gravity spell, which is Meteorite. So that was the one point where I personally used summons to beat on her, as I was able to try to channel my one spell that actually do any damage to her whatsoever. So that was, I think, sort of the advantage and disadvantage of the mage, the wizard characters. I didn't feel like that in the main game, or even really the expansion, you got a lot of different ways to play it, or that your arsenal vastly expanded. One thing that this game does very, very well is give you a huge amount of value for what you get for this game. This is a big world. I was thinking about it this morning. I think there's 9 or 10 full range zones that you get. So you do get a little fatigue for me personally as you get to a new zone. You realize how much there is to do in a new zone. That's, I guess, because you're playing a lot. There's amazing exploration there, but similar to when I was playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at the beginning of this year, sometimes I wonder whether a game can want to give you so much value that it goes from expansive to bloated. I think this is sort of similar to AAA games from like 10, 12 years ago. Like, they want to give you like a completionist achievement hunting experience. Sometimes, this is not popular. I don't think this is like a popular impression, but to some degree, I think this game sometimes veers into that. Like, how many catacombs is the right amount of catacombs, or how many is that we need a catacomb or two in every single zone? how many of those like crypto towers with a slight puzzle to open it with a memory stone on top do you need before you're just penciling in crypto tower per region? Obviously you want to be able to use boss assets more than once, and to get a random Godfrey the Grafted showing up in like a field, and to be able to revisit different people in different circumstances, perhaps with like a different element attached to them or something like that. That's obviously a good thing. But how many putrid tree spirits do you really need to? How many tree spirits do you really need to tackle? How many of those like doggies in the catacomb that rise up and slam down do you need to do? Sometimes I do think the game does verge onto here's so much stuff to do that if you're someone who does want to play a fairly like complete game style, it gets a little fatiguing, I think. I was surprised by story-wise. As I was saying before, you can learn a lot of the lore and get a lot from this game if you continue to look at it. But to me personally, as someone who's playing, as I was saying with this previous topic, as someone who wants to play a number of games and to continue to play a lot of games, comparing this to Sekiro, which I did feel like had emotionally resonant moments and a truly touching dynamic between the two main characters, I found in this game that there aren't too many, consequential story beats. And the ones that you do have, I kind of had to ask myself, like, do I actually give a shit about this? I suppose that's the Stormtop of Giants, what you do there with Melina, reaching the Erdtree. There's not really a decision point there. And then the ending of the game to some degree. Like, do you have enough context in these moments to really care about what's happening, or are you just kind of going along for the ride? Those are points that I think that with a game that is so much more accessible than before, that's a game that's so much more broadly appealing to so many more people. I understand what they do with these games, where if you want story, you can get it. If you don't, if you just want to play a boss call, if you just want to run around, kill stuff, you can do it. I just feel like with this game, with so much lore to it, I kind of, to some degree, feel like the major story points, the major beats, could have felt like I cared more. These games are sort of classic, where the ending of the game and the cutscene at the end of the expansion are still like a minute, 90 seconds, whatever. Cool. We got through it. That's great. But with the quest lines being sort of scanty, them being a little bit like hard to catch sometimes to some degree, I think that maybe there's a little bit of like a missed opportunity there. The other main things I wanted to kind of tackle about this game is I might backtrack a little bit here, but I'd also like to speak with the expansion a little bit as well. Typically the DLCs are the most challenging things. I don't think I'm going to like remember much of like the traversal and exploration of the DLC to some degree. I don't think that's really like what the thing that's sticking around with me for all these points. But it does have, what you are going to remember is those boss fights. Rolana, extraordinarily challenging as like a mage slayer. Generally speaking, through all of these games, my hugest difficulty learning curve spikes were in Bloodborne, especially because I played the DLC in New Game Plus. And it was just sort of like the first few of these games that I played. And you really learn how to start to tackle and approach a boss fight, kind of like a manager, like patience, iterate on weapon stuff, and try to get through it. And the two biggest blocks I ever had were Ludwig and Lawrence in the Bloodborne New Game Plus DLC. Ludwig is probably a solid 12 hours for me, and Lawrence is probably like in the 7 range. And then throughout the rest of this game has been like 3 hours is fairly tough, I think. Nothing really broke past that point. Probably Millennia was a bit harder and stuff like that in the main game, but nothing too egregious until we get to the expansion. And then we get to fights where, especially because I wasn't using the Shadow Tree fragments at all and trying to do it with 0 blessings, some of these fights were extremely challenging. Like hour per hour, some of the hardest ones ever. To approach the difficulty of Ludwig was Mesmer. Mesmer, I think, is like probably the best fight in the expansion. I think it's extraordinary. Very, very exacting. It really teaches you how the tempo of a Phase 2 becomes this test, where the Phase 1 is the warm-up, you learn the moves, you get to see sort of the shadow of what's to come. But then you get to Phase 2, and especially as a caster, you're balancing health, health flasks, mana flasks, counterattacking, dodging, to some degree watching your stamina, and just the pace of everything is so much faster that you have to start making trade-offs and decisions. But what reaction can I do at what point? A lot of the other bosses I think are like pretty fun, though not terribly challenging, like Ramina. There's some other ones as well. Midra I found surprisingly difficult. That was around the point where it was one of the points where I realized if you are playing a mage, the biggest thing I would have done differently, I should have mentioned this before, the biggest thing I would have done differently if I played a mage, if I played a caster again, is obviously I would kind of keep my intelligence and mind stats from max output up, and then keep your health up to some reasonable point that you're not getting one shot. But I would probably keep my endurance up 100% for sure next time with the rest of my stats. One, because stamina is often the choke point for free casting if you're trying to punish somebody. And also because your equipment load. I would very much say that I would keep a light roll the entire game as a mage in the future if I played again. If you can keep a sheet, I don't really much care about the offhand staffs. They're nice to use the Staff of Loss or the Meteor Staff or something. I think they kind of limit your playstyle a little bit into how many spells you can use in your arsenal. Like, do I want to spam Night Combat the entire game? Like so many people advocate in chat. It's so boring. I used it for Millennia and some other times, but I'm not really a fan too much to be limited to that few spells. I find a shield, like a nice 100% physical resist shield, light enough that you can still light roll, and you put the Carry and Retaliation Ash of War on it. That's an extraordinarily satisfying playstyle. To some degree. I like that a lot. And then, so I'd keep a light roll the entire time. That's the main thing I would have done. That's the main thing I would have done differently. But then you get to Radon at the end of it, and you want a big capstone difficulty spike at the end of the game. And this was definitely that. A lot of people had heard that like Phase 2 of Radon was like unimaginable bullshit. And that is ultimately true, I think. The reality is that it's very, very difficult to me with the readability of his Phase 2 to really learn actionable information of what you should be doing differently. This is like one of the only, maybe the only fight ever where I've been like, I need to watch a fucking video to see how I'm supposed to deal with these moves. You know what I mean? Like, okay, so there's so many of like these shadow attack moves. Also, the fight is a little buggy. A lot of times you'll stop a combo in the middle of a combo and jump to another one in a way that's fine if you want to have some sort of modular attack sequence, but it doesn't seem or feel right. Sometimes, I swear to God, when he's doing some of those attacks where he sends out a bunch of shadows at you in a row before crashing down, I swear to God some of those shadows are going at like the ghosts of other players running around the arena. Another thing about Dark Souls game generally is I'm a little surprised sometimes that they do have the ghosts of other players in a boss fight with you. I love the ghosts, seeing what other people are doing, but in a boss fight that's a little distracting. That surprises me a little bit. I swear to God the fight is a little bit buggy, but sometimes you can use that to your advantage, because one of the main keys I got to Verdun is I had to basically completely change. This is the one fight where I totally changed my build, where I basically turned into a Snow Witch and used only Glintstone, Icecrag, the Frostbolt, and Ronnie's Dark Moon. It's the only fight where I ever completely changed my playstyle to go against it. And the reason is that it's the one fight where him having a bleed weakness, a Scarlet Raw weakness, and a Frost weakness was something I actually calculated. And I think that's actually a flaw. If you play through an entire game and you play 200 hours of a game in the expansion, largely using a similar sort of playstyle of moves, I'm not going to respec to fight a boss. But this is the best thing I could have done within the capacity of still having max intelligence, high levels of mind, good amounts of vigor. And to actually get through this, because with like the Storm, you can never use Comet Azure, and with a standard Comet, which is like your highest efficiency spell you possibly have, with the level of magic resistance he has, you would take at 900 to 1100 a pop, no blessings. This would, I think you'd have to have 8 or 9 mana flash to get through it. With a boss that does so much splash damage, that does not seem necessarily reasonable. So I do think that's one of the rare fights where the ways they made this fight difficult was to make it harder to read, and I basically felt like I was sort of shoehorned to some degree into changing my playstyle. So it's satisfying that I found a playstyle that worked within my spec of using Dark Moons both offensively and defensively to block his meteorites, but also basically changing to the Azure staff, which is the faster cast staff rather than the higher damage staff, and to like basically pull up Frostbloods. But the biggest thing I learned about all this, as it took me like several days to beat him, was that whenever you think of a boss fight being hard and you're starting to be stymied on it, there's this huge ego check moment where you're like, fuck it, man, it's been 2 days. I'm going to use all my blessings and move on with my life. I don't want to go through this. But when you break through that, you get to a point where if you're playing video games and you're streaming them, it doesn't really matter at some level what you're doing. I'm doing something challenging, I'm doing something hard, I'm learning it. That's pretty cool. So by like the third or fourth day, honestly, this took me like so long. You're at the point where just like you're playing video games, but this is just the video game you're playing, and you're having this insane duel with Radon that's like literally the biggest pound for pound, hour for hour challenge I've ever done. So I think that's actually really sick, and you kind of learn a lot about like forbearance and like to some degree humility about something like that. I'm trying to keep this a little short because 30 minutes is probably a bit long, but that's most of what I have sort of got the sense of in this game. They've made this broadly accessible to a lot of people. They brought sort of an RPG nature to people who want a challenge in games. Visually speaking, this is about as good as it gets. Musically, they've sort of veered more toward ambiance than I would generally prefer. The world's pretty desolate, it's pretty quiet. There is music sometimes. Remember, sometimes there's a crescendo, climactic moment for the boss fights, which seems a little more, like the music is a little more noticeable. But I think generally speaking, they've, in my sense, made it pretty ambient. It's kind of below the consciousness line a lot, which I guess is good. You don't want it dominating it, but I don't feel like I have much of a sense of the music of this game to some degree. This is just like simply totally justified for being as large of a game and as successful a game as it is. They deserve their success, man. What an achievement. Alright, that's it. Baldur's Gate 3, patch 7 to do an evil ending, probably coming up in September. I like to play some Valheim, and then I'm looking at Shining Force 3 a little bit. Now they have a good expansion patch. So those things are next. Okay, bye.